Hi, this is Paul, and this is my Rough Draft for Sunday series. I've been doing a series on the post-Easter, pre-Ascension, and Pentecost sightings and stories of Jesus, and this week I'm looking at John 21. In the news this month, there's been a lot of discussion about Bill Hybels' resignation from Willow Creek. Bill Hybels grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. He became a youth pastor of a large church in Chicago and founded Willow Creek Church. And Willow Creek Church became really the flagship church for the seeker movement that dominated the evangelical scene in the 80s and 90s. Denominations like my own, I sent junkets to Willow Creek to learn how to create a safe space for a dangerous message, to have fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ, to have prevailing churches. And Bill Hybels was at the center of all of this. And for many who are not familiar with the history of evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s especially, he was a tremendously important person in a movement that transformed the way, especially non-denominational and also many denominational churches did ministry in the United States, Canada, and all over the world. And Bill Hybels was a tremendously important leader with many, many tapes. We get tapes every week from the Willow Creek Association, books, making his resignation and all of the stories that have been coming out surrounding it just terribly sad. Most of the stories involve impropriety with women. Invitations to hotel rooms, boat, private jet flights, messages like "don't bring your husband," "you look sexier if you dress this way," complaining to other women when he's alone with them about struggles in his own marriage, church leadership. Now Willow Creek was for evangelical churches out in front on having women in their women elders, deacons, and pastors, women in their governing board. And so, a lot of people who say, well, this kind of thing only happens when there's male-dominated leadership. Well, there was a lot of women in leadership at Willow, and a number of the women who complained about them had significant leadership questions. And the church leadership, not just the men, but the women as well, failed to take seriously these stories. So where does that leave us? Well, Ed Stetzer wrote I thought quite a powerful piece in Christianity Today as well on the moral of moral failings of Christian leaders, and went into this some way, and basically, the system has to change, but that's such boilerplate language for our culture right now that we believe that the kinds of failures that were that Bill Hybels had for years. This is a failure of a system. And yeah, I can agree with that. It's a failure of a system. But implicit in that complaint is the hope that we can build a system where there will be no failure. This week's sermon in John 21 is really all about John 18. And in John 18, very famously, Jesus is arrested. And when Jesus gets arrested, the disciples try plan A, which for humanity is violence. Jesus gets arrested, and the disciples take out their sword, and Peter cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest, and Jesus says, "Stop, put your swords away," and he heals the servant of the high priest's ear. And then his disciples flee. And this is after Peter made such bold statements about, if everyone falls away, I won't fall away. I'll follow you to the death. And Peter runs. And then Peter John sneaks Peter into the high priest's quarters. Peter wants to kind of keep an eye on the things, and the girl who was the doorkeeper said to Peter, "You're not one of this man's disciples too, are you?" He replied, "No, I'm not." Now the slaves and the guards were standing around a charcoal fire they had made, warming themselves because it was cold. Peter also standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, Simon Peter standing in the courtyard, warming himself, they said to him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" Peter denied it. "I am not." One of the high priest's slaves, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the orchard with him?" Peter denied it again, and immediately the rooster crowed. Now, my question for you is, were Peter's sin, if we look at this as singular, worse than Bill Hybels' sins? Were Bill Hybels' sins more disqualifying than Peter's for leadership? That's a really hard question. And how we answer the question reveals a lot about our assumptions about what's wrong with the world, what's important with the world, what character looks like. And I think especially for us in our particular context, it's a very difficult question. Now, John 21 is an interesting chapter. Some people think John 21 is an epilogue for the Gospel of John, because the Gospel seems to end at John 20, and then we have this chapter, John 21. And the chapter is full of symbolism. It revolves around two things. It revolves around fishing, where fishing is obviously symbolically laden in the stories of Jesus. I will make you fishers of men, or fishers of people. And shepherding. Shepherding is a long symbolic history in the Bible. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." That's really a royal psalm, because to be the king of Israel was to be the shepherd. And John 10, the good shepherd. David was a shepherd. And when Nathan confronts David with the sin of adultery with Bathsheba and covering up Uriah's death, Nathan brings in a parable about a sheep. Numerous shepherding references in the Old and New Testament. It's one of the dominant symbolic motifs of the Bible. And it begins here. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Now, it's very interesting that the word that's chosen here for revealed is significant. This is a theophany of sorts. And it's also interesting how John chooses here the designation, the Sea of Tiberias. He could have said the Sea of Galilee, but he chooses the Sea of Tiberias, that in some ways presents this story to the broader Roman context much more than just the Jewish context. Now, this is how he did so. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael, who was at Cana in Galilee. Now, this is the first time in the Gospel of John we hear Nathanael connected with Cana. Cana, obviously, in John 4, where with Jesus' famous miracle of water to wine at Cana. The sons of Zebedee and two other disciples were also with them. Now, if you count the number there are 7, which is also very interesting. Simon said, "I'm going fishing. We will go with you," they replied. And never has a fishing trip been examined or judged so harshly than this one. So they get into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. And it's very interesting, because the Greek word here used for caught is not the usual word that you would use for catching fish or catching animals. It's in fact the word for seized, which John has used for Jesus being seized. And it's much more of a common word for used for seizing men. And so right away with the boat and the fishing, we're just invited to pick up this fishing motif of Jesus calling his disciples fishers of men. And now here they're fishing, and by themselves they can catch nothing. And this is, many commentators see this as a subtle message of impotence on the part of the disciples for being able to fulfill their calling. In a sense, now Peter as their leader, but they fled. They fled and didn't stay by the cross of Jesus. when it was already very early morning, and the last very early morning we had was Easter morning. So John is connecting these stories together. Jesus stood on the beach. Now, actually, the land, the story there is earth, and so already we have a sea and earth connection going here. But the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children." And again, many have noted that Jesus talks down to them and very much, even though they're not recognizing him, presents himself as their father or their master or their superior. "Children, you don't have any fish, do you?" And the question is asked exactly that way. It's the assumption is no. And again, we have the overtones here of Peter and the disciples trying to go out and act, but without Jesus and without his power and authority, they're impotent. They can do nothing. They can't be fishers of men as they were called to. They replied no. And he told them, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they threw the net, and they were not able to pull it in because of the large number of fish. Now this is a miracle of the new creation, where Jesus is master of creation and in a sense guides the fish into their net, and there are so many fish they can't bring it in. Now obviously commentators, especially ancient ones, have read this story to be about the church. Then that disciple whom Jesus loved says to Peter. Now right away we're going to see the tension between Jesus and these two disciples in this story. It is the Lord. So Simon Peter, when he heard that it was the Lord, tied around himself his outer garment, for he was naked, and threw himself into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net of fish, because they were not far from the land, about 200 cubits away. That's about 100 yards. Now, what is so interesting to me about this passage when I read it this time is almost no modern commentators, in fact, almost no commentators talk about this little piece of the story. Now, and almost all modern commentators try to analyze this portion of the story in terms of the mechanics and the physics of the literal history that the story is referring to. I think actually this part of the story is extremely symbolic, and it's intended to be symbolic. Jews weren't naked in public, even in a group of men. And so he would have been wearing a loincloth. So a lot of commentators, well, he wasn't actually naked, but that's the word that's used. And then he ties his garment around him. And now this language is going to be picked up later in the story in a very important place. And he throws himself into the sea. Also, it's important to notice that later in the story, we're going to have Peter, son of Jonah. Now, there's a textual issue involved in that I'm not going to go into. But who is Peter right now? Isn't Peter in some sense a Jonah figure? And whereas the pagan sailors kvetch at throwing Jonah into the sea to silence the storm, Peter throws himself into the sea, and he wraps his cloak around him because he's naked. There's so much symbolic overtones going in this story, and besides that, this little segment has no meaning in the rest of the story, because when we get to the next point, we don't have Peter getting to the shore first. There's no practical reason why Peter has done this. There is something more to the fact that Peter throws himself into the sea. And now again, you've got sea is a very deep symbolic figure in the Bible. Of course, the Bible opens with this sea of chaos, and it's out of the sea that the sea monsters come. And the waters of baptism are in a sense a death of us into the sea. And so I can't explain exactly how this is working, but it seems to me that in this story right here, this is the sense in which Peter casts himself into the sea. And now what's very interesting, so when they got out to the land, again, we have land and sea, the contrast here, they saw a charcoal fire. And the words used for charcoal fire here is only found twice in the New Testament, once in John 18 where we read it before, and once here. And so everything in this story, both the fishing part and this part here, and Peter casting himself into the sea, this is all about Peter and leadership. And by virtue of Peter, all of the rest of the disciples. And we see Peter and the disciples impotent, 7 of them, the number of fullness, impotent in being able to fulfill their task. Why? Well, are they naked? And Peter casts himself into the sea. Is it baptism? Is it suicide? Is it chaos? So Jesus, when they get to the land, they saw a charcoal fire and laid there, and a fish lying on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have now caught. Now it's very interesting too here, where Jesus has a meal ready for them of fish and bread, things that Jesus has multiplied in the past. But now he says, you bring the fish. Bring the things that you caught. By the way, you caught with my power, but bring the fish that you caught. That's what you're going to derive your sustenance from. So Peter got into the boat, and here again, Peter goes now back into the boat. And this is, in a sense, if you look at the boat and the storm in Matthew, the boat is often symbolizing the church. So Peter has to get back into the boat and hauls the net to land full of fish. Now they're coming out of chaos and they're coming onto the land, and it's full of fish, 153, and which is, again, a hugely debated number. I think it does really symbolize the harvest. Although there were so many, the net was not torn. So now the net is symbolic of the church. Jesus said to them, come eat breakfast. But none of the disciples dared to ask him. This is this distance after the resurrection between Jesus and the disciples. And to what can we account this distance? Is it the disciples' failure at the moment of crisis? Is it the disciples' failure to stand with Jesus? Is it the disciples' failure to see Jesus? Is it the disciples' failure to embody Jesus in that moment of crisis? They're even afraid to talk to him. Who are you? Because on one hand, they're afraid. On the other hand, they know who he is. Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise. So then is there a Eucharist? Is there a Eucharist theme coming through here? It was now the 3rd time. 3 days, 3. It was now the 3rd time Jesus has revealed himself to his disciples. Are they not yet going to see him after the 3rd time? Now when they had eaten breakfast, he sets a meal before them in the presence of their enemies. Now when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And again, the debate is furious. Do you love me more than the boats and the nets? Do you love me more than the disciples love me? Do you love me more than what? He said to them, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him again a 2nd time, Simon, son of John, son of Jonah. I better correct that if I want to keep my thing going here. Hang on. It's good to run through these things. Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, shepherd my sheep. He said to him a 3rd time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Simon, Simon, you are a son of Jonah. That is how you are. When the time for arrest came, what did you default to? Violence. You defaulted to the tools of revolution in the world to try to bring about my kingdom, and I stopped you. And then you fled. And then you denied me. You lived, you didn't deny me like Judas. You didn't go all the way. You stayed in the twilight of our relationship. And that was the way. You tried to keep yourself and not lose me. And that was the way you tried to work it, Peter. And Peter knows it. Peter was distressed because he said it to him a 3rd time. And of course, this mirrors the 3 times of the denial. And again, How do you evaluate Peter's sin? Do you evaluate it worse than Bill Hybels' betrayal um, of his marriage vows, of his calling, of the trust that that the church had in him? Maybe think about someone that you think has done worse than Bill Hybels. How do you evaluate it? Do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now what's interesting here is that, and I've never heard this brought up with this passage. Why doesn't Jesus say, Peter, you're done? Why doesn't Jesus say, Peter, get out of the twilight of our relationship? At least Judas had the guts to take it all the way. He tells Peter to get back in the game. Peter who has denied him. Peter who has failed him. This is such an interesting passage. It's such a powerful passage. Jesus is installing in leadership this flawed leader who has been broken. Now we might like to imagine, well, Peter's been tried and Peter's been restored, so Peter's going to be perfect. And this is really the key verse of this chapter. And it's designated, it tells us exactly that it is by the truly, truly, or in the Old King James, the verily, verily, in Greek, the amen, amen. Truly, truly, I tell you, when you were young, you tied your clothes around yourself and walked where you wanted. Peter just tied his clothes around him and jumped into the sea of chaos, like Jonah. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, as in crucifixion, and someone else will tie you up onto a cross and carry you where you do not want to go. Now he said this to indicate by what kind of death he would glorify God. And after that he said to him, follow me. He's not telling Peter to go away. Judas isn't at the meeting. Judas has already ended his life. He's telling Peter, even with your failings, I want you to stay. Even with your failings, you must follow me. The church is for sinners. The church is for betrayers. The church is for deniers. Now, all church leaders are flawed, more than you can or want to know. That includes me. That includes everyone I've known. My father was a hero of mine. My father never did any of those. I don't think anyone has ever alleged that my father did any of those things that Bill Hybels was accused of. My father didn't have a private plane or a boat or a vacation home. He barely had an office. Yet my father was a flawed leader. And I remember another friend, Dante Venegas, who was a pastor of the second church I was ever a member of. My father's church was the first, and Dante was the pastor of the second. I remember Dante once telling me about how my father had failed him and how Dante was hurt. There are no perfect leaders. Dante wasn't perfect. My father wasn't perfect. I am not perfect. And this is not the place for me to tell you all the ways that I'm not perfect, but just take my word for it. Was Peter or Bill Hybels worse? Doesn't matter. And now don't get me wrong. I am not saying Hybels shouldn't have resigned. I'm not saying the elders of Willow Creek shouldn't have taken action when accusations were heard. In fact, if Hybels had been called to account for such things far earlier in his ministry, how much better couldn't it all have been? I'm not denying what we have learned. I am challenging the deep assumption that we can, within our power, create systems or by our own moral performance, conquer the sin that plagues us and plagues our institutions. And my proof for this is Peter doesn't, at this point, get it even. Peter turned and saw the other disciples whom Jesus loved following them, who also leaned back on his chest at the dinner and said, "Lord, who is the one betraying you?" Who is the one betraying you? Judas? Yes. Peter is going to. All of them are going to run. So when he saw this one, Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, but what about this one?" Jesus said to him, "If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." C.S. Lewis picks this up in such a poignant scene in The Horse and His Boy. And here we are, whether you're a leader in the church, whether you're a follower in the church, whether you're not in the church at all. This is the reality that Peter is a denier. And the honesty of the gospel records don't cover this up. It takes it full on. And Jesus challenges Peter despite his failings and despite his, he took it poorly. And Jesus says, don't look at other people. You must follow me. You must follow me. It would be lovely to imagine that Peter's little talk shaped him right up. Peter was still playing petty games of status and preference. Paul will call Peter to account in Galatians from shrinking back to eat for the Gentiles. Peter was never a perfect leader. God uses flawed leaders. God breaks leaders. God breaks us because only what has died can be raised. And he breaks our hearts so that we have a chance to be filled with him and not so full of ourselves. And if there's any liability for leaders, and I think this is especially poignant in the Hybels case, it is when we get full of ourselves. It's when we get, when we start believing as my friend Rod says, the clapping gods. It's when we start believing our own publicity that we're great and we can do no wrong and we're full of ourselves and we always make the right moves, and when we are rewarded with acclaim and with popularity and with money and with privilege and with status and with the positions and the seats that everyone wants, this is when we're most vulnerable to ourselves. The gospel is not a story of perfect people being rewarded for their moral performance, but broken people being rescued from their brokenness by God's grace and him using them still. So, the message of this is, you must follow me. Where? Well, read the story. He tells Peter exactly what discipleship will mean. Right now, you've got a lot of freedom and you can do what you want to do. In facing me, you throw yourself into the sea just like Jonah, Peter, son of Jonah. Do you love me? Peter wants to live in the twilight of his relationship. And Jesus says, no, you will love me. You will serve me. And they will take you where you don't want to go. And they will stretch out your arms and they will crucify you. That is what it means to follow. Where you will be stretched out, humiliated, broken, possibly in the most pointless way possible. This is exactly where God brings redemption. And then the question is, well, what will we do? So what is God doing with Bill Hybels? Well, he's probably breaking him. Who knows the pain that's going on in his household, in his marriage, over all of this stuff. And I pray that, that there'll be repentance. And, is God done with Bill Hybels? I don't know. Maybe he's done with him in the public eye. I don't believe God is done with any of us until they put us in the grave. And even then, it's the next chapter. So God uses flawed leaders. He used Bill Hybels when Bill Hybels was doing this stuff. I'll pray that he uses him after. But the lesson really isn't about Bill Hybels. He's not going to hear this sermon. The question is, are you in? Your past is no excuse for leaving. And that finally is kind of the difference between Peter and Judas. Judas runs away from the church. Peter stays in. Judas goes down to despair. Judas leaves the church. Peter stays in. Your current flaws do not exclude you. Your current sins do not exclude you. You should confess them and repent if you are able. I should change that to sins from flaws. Your current sins do not exclude you. You should confess them and repent if you are able. That's what we're called to do. And so often we're so full of ourselves, we'd rather stay in the twilight away from Jesus, not too close, or he'll see us, and then we'll be destroyed. Well, what will actually be destroyed is our pride and our sin and all of these things that really are keeping us back. Don't compare yourselves to others. Don't look at the other disciple. Don't look at the other leader. Don't look at the other person and say, well, what about him? It isn't fair. Jesus says, I'm not dealing with you fairly. I'm dealing with you with what you need according to what I choose for you. And you have questions about that, well, you have to take it up with him. You must follow me. You must follow me.